My stomach literally dropped through the floor when the waiter came back to our table with a face whiter than the napkin he was clutching, leaning in conspiratorially just as I reached for a second breadstick. He whispered, and I mean whispered, "I'm terribly sorry, but all the cards were declined. The primary Visa, the backup MasterCard, even the debit card. All blocked." "Why are all the cards blocked?" is exactly what I stammered, feeling the blood rush to my cheeks as I glanced across the table at my mother-in-law, Susan, whose eyes were already darting nervously around the busy, upscale restaurant. We were completely trapped, unable to pay for a massive, multi-course anniversary lunch that Susan had been insisting on for weeks. It was a disaster, a public humiliation, but I knew, with a certainty that chilled me to the bone, that this wasn't a bank error. This was him. This was my husband, Mark, making a statement. So, tell me honestly, knowing what I'm about to reveal about Mark and his unbelievably entitled family, was I wrong for the utterly brutal, life-changing decision I made immediately after we finally walked out of that restaurant? The story of the blocked cards didn't start with an appetizer and a bad PIN. It started years earlier, the day I married into the Mark and Susan show. Mark and I had been high school sweethearts, the kind of couple everyone expected to get married, but what I didn't realize until the ink was dry on the marriage certificate was that our relationship was essentially a three-person circus, with Susan, my mother-in-law, as the ringmaster. Susan was the definition of financially dependent, a charming, highly critical woman in her late 60s who hadn't held a steady job since Mark was in college. Her husband, Mark's father, had passed away suddenly 5 years before our wedding, leaving Susan with a modest house but no real financial planning. From day one of our marriage, Mark stepped in as her primary, and eventually, only source of income. It started small, covering her utility bills, paying for her cable, lending her $100 here and there. But it escalated, quickly. By year 3, Mark was sending Susan a non-negotiable, fixed monthly allowance of $3,000. Yes, $3,000. And this wasn't for medical needs or anything essential. This was for high-end boutique shopping, trips to the spa, and what Susan called maintenance on her social life. My resentment simmered, turning into a rolling boil. Mark made a comfortable, but not extravagant, living as a software engineer. We were saving for a down payment on a house, trying to start a family, and every month, that $3,000 was a massive black hole sucking the life out of our future. I confronted Mark dozens of times. Our arguments followed the same infuriating script. I would say, "Mark, we can't afford this. She's perfectly capable of getting a part-time job, or at least downsizing. We're eating ramen so she can get a facial." And Mark would respond with that same glazed-over look of filial duty, "She's my mother, Amy. She's sacrificed everything for me. This is my obligation. She's going through a lot." What exactly she was going through always remained a mystery, unless going through meant enjoying a life of leisure funded entirely by her son and, by extension, me. The real kicker? Susan was not grateful. She treated the money like an insufficient tribute. She would constantly criticize my clothes, my cooking, and particularly my spending habits, despite the fact that I drove a 7-year-old car and hadn't bought a new handbag since before we were engaged. The tension reached its peak over the upcoming 5-year anniversary. I wanted a quiet weekend trip, maybe a cozy cabin rental upstate, something intimate and focused on us. Susan, however, decided we should host a huge celebratory lunch at the Belvedere, the city's most pretentious and expensive French restaurant. She actually called the restaurant and made the reservation herself, telling Mark that it was the least she could do to thank him for being such a wonderful, devoted son. Mark, of course, saw this as an honor and agreed immediately, without consulting me. When I found out, I was livid. I told Mark I wasn't going. I said, "This is not about our anniversary. This is Susan orchestrating a performance where she gets to be the star, and we get to pay a month's mortgage for it." Mark accused me of being selfish, of hating his mother, and of trying to isolate him. That's when I finally told him something I'd been holding back. "If you go through with this, if you spend 1 cent of our joint savings on this ridiculous lunch, I will open my own separate bank account, and I will start taking steps to protect my future from your mother's entitlement." It was the ultimate ultimatum, and it hung in the air for 2 solid days. Mark didn't acknowledge it directly, but he canceled the reservation. He told me, "Fine, we'll do something small, just the 2 of us." I felt a flicker of hope. Then, the morning of the anniversary, Mark woke up with a guilty face. He said, "Amy, listen." Susan was so hurt. She'd already told all her friends. She begged me to just do a small, quick lunch with her today, just a little something at the Belvedere.
She promised to pay for it herself.
It's a surprise. I should have known better. I should have locked my keys in a safe and stayed home. But he used the word small, and he used the word surprise. Mark, to my total shock, did not attend the lunch. He claimed he had an unexpected emergency meeting at work, a last-minute crisis that required him to drive an hour out of the city. He looked genuinely stressed, gave me a quick peck, and rushed out the door. He asked me, "Could you please just meet Susan there?
She's waiting."
It would mean the world to me. Feeling sorry for him, and trying to be the bigger person, I reluctantly agreed to go meet Susan, just for a polite, quick appearance. When I arrived at the Belvedere, Susan was already seated, not at a small, discreet table, but at a huge, prominent banquette in the center of the main dining room. She had ordered a bottle of $300 champagne before I even got there. The quick lunch quickly morphed into a 3-hour marathon: oysters, French onion soup, 2 separate main courses for Susan, and more wine. She spent the entire meal complaining about her neighbor's dog, detailing her latest fight with her manicurist, and occasionally dropping a backhanded compliment my way, like, "Oh, Amy, that dress is fine, dear." A bit loud, but fine. I sat there, sipping my sparkling water, counting the minutes and the escalating dollar signs. Every time I tried to steer the conversation back to Mark, or the house, or anything related to our future, she'd wave her hand dismissively and order another side of truffle fries. Finally, the feast ended. The bill arrived, encased in a small, sleek leather booklet. Susan dramatically reached into her purse. "Oh, my darling," she purred, "my hands are simply full of truffle oil.
Be a dear and just put this on Mark's card.
It's a gift from the children to me, after all."
I hesitated. I knew Mark had promised her he wouldn't use our joint funds.
But Mark's wallet, with all the joint cards, was sitting on my kitchen counter. He had asked me to carry my own smaller wallet with my personal cards, which I rarely used and weren't linked to our main account, just in case she insisted on paying.
That's when I felt the cold dread.
I realized Mark hadn't gone to an emergency meeting. He deliberately left all the cards with me, knowing Susan would never pay, effectively forcing me to foot the bill or create a scene. He had made me the villain in his mother's eyes, and he was safely an hour away. That realization, the sheer manipulation of it, was the moment everything changed. I calmly took the bill and told Susan, "Susan, I don't have access to Mark's primary visa today.
I'm sure your card will work just fine." Susan's smile wavered.
She pulled out a sleek black card and handed it to the waiter, already turning back to me to start gossiping about her neighbor's dog again. And that's when the waiter returned, pale and apologetic, muttering those fateful words. All the cards were declined. Susan's face was a study in pure, unadulterated shock. She fumbled in her oversized bag, pulling out another 2 cards, both bearing Mark's name, both of which had been sitting in her purse the whole time. The waiter returned again, shaking his head.
"Blocked. Every single one."
The entire restaurant felt like it was watching us. Susan looked at me, a flicker of panic mixed with accusation in her eyes. "Amy, what did you do?" I just shrugged, feigning ignorance, all the while knowing exactly what happened. Mark, in a rare, brief, but utterly misguided attempt to placate me after my ultimatum, had clearly called the bank and put a temporary block on the joint accounts. He must have done it to prove he was responsible before rushing off to his fake meeting, forgetting that he had also given Susan several of his personal use cards for her extravagant use, which were also linked to our main joint accounts. He hadn't just blocked Susan, he had blocked me and himself, too.
We were both stranded. So that's the situation I was in.
Sitting there, in a pretentious, overpriced restaurant, with a $650 bill and a terrified mother-in-law who was staring at me like I was personally responsible for the collapse of the global banking system. The waiter was hovering, clearly expecting a resolution. Mark was unreachable, in a meeting. I was humiliated, but deep down, a voice was screaming, "This is your chance. This is your leverage." Before I tell you what happened next, the decision that completely tore my marriage apart and sent Susan into a spiral of histrionics, I want you to pause the video right now and comment below what you would have done in my shoes.
Would you have called Mark and begged him to fix his mistake? Would you have frantically called a friend for a loan?
Or would you have done what I did, and used the disaster to finally settle the score?
Tell me your move.
I looked Susan dead in the eye, and the fear I saw there was glorious.
For the first time in 5 years, she was completely powerless.
I reached into my small wallet and pulled out my little used
Entirely. Separate, personal savings account debit card. The one that was just mine.
The one that had maybe $1,200 saved from tiny freelance gigs I did on the side. I looked at the waiter, a flicker of cold resolution hardening my face, and I said, I have one final card, but I won't use it. Susan, you said you were going to pay for this lunch as a gift to Mark.
You said you had your own funds.
The fact that all Mark's cards are blocked suggests a much larger problem, doesn't it? I didn't wait for her to respond. I stood up, leaning over the table, and whispered so only she could hear, I will pay this bill right now. But only under one condition. You sign an agreement today that you will not accept a single cent of financial support from Mark for the next 6 months. You have to get a job, Susan, or downsize, or something. If you don't, I will use my personal funds to pay this bill, and then I will take every single step I legally can to divorce Mark and protect myself from this financial drain.
This bill is your wake-up call.
Choose. My money and 6 months of financial independence, or public humiliation and the destruction of your son's marriage.
Susan's jaw actually dropped.
She tried to bluster, to threaten, to call Mark, but I simply said, The manager is coming over now, Susan. Your time is up. She looked at the approaching manager, then at the bill, then at my steely eyes, and finally, she completely crumbled. Tears welled up, but this time they were real.
They were tears of pure fear and loss of control. Fine, she choked out. Just pay it.
You are a terrible, selfish woman, Amy, but just pay it.
I didn't trust her word.
I pulled a notebook and a pen out of my purse and scrawled a crude but clear contract right there on the table, stating she would refuse any and all direct or indirect financial aid from Mark for a minimum of 6 months, and that Mark would be informed immediately. I made her sign it, a wobbly, shaky signature beneath the massive stack of receipts. Only then did I use my $1,200 card to pay the $650 bill. The aftermath was a Category 5 emotional hurricane. When Mark finally called me back, hours later, I didn't scream or cry.
I was eerily calm.
I told him what he had done, how he set me up, how he tried to make me pay for a lunch he authorized, and how his manipulative behavior was the final straw. Then, I informed him about the contract.
He exploded.
He called me a heartless monster, a vindictive shrew, and a destroyer of families. He admitted he blocked the accounts, but only to prove a point to me, not realizing Susan had the extra cards. He wasn't even sorry about the manipulation. He was furious I had weaponized his mistake.
We had the biggest fight of our lives right there on the phone.
I hung up, and the very next day, I opened a separate bank account and moved every cent of my savings and future earnings into it. Susan, bless her entitled heart, tried to hold Mark to the agreement she signed, because, for her, honor meant saving face, even if it bankrupted her emotionally. She started calling Mark several times a day, weeping and demanding he override the agreement, but Mark knew I wasn't bluffing.
He knew I would leave.
For the first 2 months, she was miserable, calling me 100 different versions of Satan, but Mark held firm, terrified of losing me.
The surprising conclusion?
Susan, pushed to the absolute limit, finally got a part-time job as a receptionist at a low-key spa.
She downsized her ridiculously high cable package.
She even started cooking dinner instead of ordering out. She wasn't happy, not by a long shot, but she was self-sufficient. Mark and I went to counseling, and it was brutal. He finally had to face the reality that he was financially abusing me to emotionally support his mother. We are still together, working on rebuilding trust, but it's fragile, and the 6-month agreement has become a permanent understanding. Susan manages her own life. The day the cards were blocked was the worst, most humiliating, and ultimately, the best day of my marriage. I had to choose between my comfort and my sanity, and I chose my sanity. The moral of the story is simple. If you don't set a hard boundary, someone else will always set a comfortable one for themselves using your life. So, that's the whole, ugly, embarrassing story of how my mother-in-law and I couldn't pay for lunch, and how I took a disastrous moment and turned it into the ultimate financial declaration of independence. Tell me in the comments if you think I was too cruel to Susan, or if Mark deserved a bigger wake-up call. Like this video if you were on my side and believe every person has the right to financial security in their marriage. Subscribe for more stories like this where I lay out the absolute chaos of family life and the surprising ways we fight back. And share your final thoughts on this whole mess in the comments section. I'll see you all in the next story.